I don't think that he could make any decisions because of the level of impairment.
On May 17, 2017, Chris Cornell walked off the stage in Detroit alive, energized and smiling. Just hours later, he would be gone. In a late-night phone call to his wife, Vicky, he said something so unsettling it immediately set off alarm bells. For years, Cornell had seemed like the one who escaped the fate that claimed so many Seattle legends, surviving addiction, building a family, and finding new creative life. So what changed in those final hours? And what did the autopsy quietly reveal about the darkness he'd been carrying all along? This is Chris Cornell's tragic life and the darkness that took him. Chris Cornell was born Christopher John Boyle on July 20th, 1964, in Seattle, Washington. His mother, Karen Cornell, was Jewish and worked as a psychic. His father, Edward F. Boyle, was Catholic. After his parents divorced, Chris and his siblings dropped their father's last name and took their mother's maiden name instead, a quiet but meaningful break that marked an unstable beginning to his life. School never felt safe or comfortable for him. He struggled in Catholic school, asking too many questions about faith and authority until his mother pulled him out before he could be expelled. He later attended Shorewood High School, but by then, Chris was already drifting inward. One day, he stumbled into a neighbor's basement and discovered a stack of Beatles records. He took them home and spent the next 2 years obsessively listening. The music became a refuge, something steady when everything else felt chaotic. Chris described himself as a loner, deeply anxious around people. Rock music gave him an escape, but it wasn't enough to quiet his mind. Both of his parents drank heavily, and he began using alcohol and marijuana at a young age to cope. That experimentation escalated quickly. At just 14, he tried PCP, an experience that triggered severe panic disorder and agoraphobia. Soon after, he dropped out of high school and spent nearly 2 years barely leaving his house. His early adulthood was far from glamorous. While battling mental illness, he worked whatever jobs he could, dishwasher, busboy, fishmonger, sous chef, just to survive. The darkness never fully lifted during those years. Everything changed when Chris Cornell's mother bought him a snare drum. He would later say that gift saved his life. It gave him focus, direction, and a reason to keep going. He practiced constantly, teaching himself rhythm and discipline, and before long he was looking for people to play with. After a brief run in a cover band, Cornell teamed up with Hiro Yamamoto and Kim Thayil to form Soundgarden. At first, Cornell played drums, but it quickly became clear the band was strongest when he stepped out front as lead singer. They brought in Matt Cameron on drums, and the lineup finally clicked. The band moved fast. Seattle's rising indie label Sub Pop took notice and released 2 Soundgarden EPs. Their raw, heavy sound stood out immediately, and the records did far better than anyone expected. Suddenly, major labels came calling. Instead of rushing into the mainstream, Soundgarden chose another indie path and signed with SST Records, a risky move at the time. That gamble paid off. Their debut album, Ultra Mega OK, turned heads far beyond the underground scene. In 1990, it earned a Grammy nomination for Best Metal Performance, signaling that something big was happening. At that point, the jump to a major label felt inevitable. Soundgarden signed with A&M Records, becoming the first Seattle grunge band to land such a deal. With that move, they weren't just joining the industry, they were about to help define an entire generation. Soundgarden had the raw edge that defined grunge, but what truly set the band apart were Chris Cornell's lyrics. They weren't simple or disposable, they were sharp, layered, and searching. At a time when listeners wanted music that felt deeper and more honest, Cornell gave them exactly that, and that was only part of the draw. The other was his voice. Cornell possessed a rare 4-octave range, capable of sounding both ferocious and vulnerable in the same breath. Some described his singing as hypnotic, even seductive. Over time, critics and fans alike would rank him among the greatest rock vocalists of all time. Yet none of that acclaim could shield him from the sadness he carried. While living in Seattle, Cornell shared a home with fellow musician Andrew Wood, a central figure in the local scene and a close friend. When Wood died from a drug overdose at just 24, the loss shattered Cornell. He later admitted that he would sometimes think he saw Wood while driving, only to realize moments later that his friend was truly gone. Music became his way through the grief. Still a member of Soundgarden, Cornell formed Temple of the Dog as a tribute to Wood. The project included a then-unknown Eddie Vedder, whose voice on the song Hunger Strike stood out immediately. Vedder would later openly credit Cornell for helping shape his path. Meanwhile, Soundgarden was reaching new heights. In 1994, they released Super Unknown, an album that exceeded every expectation. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, went 5 times platinum in the U.S., and earned a Grammy nomination for Best Rock Album. Cornell had never been more successful or more exposed. That's why fans were stunned when, in 1998, he shifted direction and began working on a solo record. Euphoria Morning leaned away from heavy rock and toward a softer, more folk-driven sound. While it earned critical praise and another Grammy nomination, sales were disappointing, and longtime fans struggled with the change. Behind the scenes, the weight was building. The grunge scene had already lost too many voices to depression and addiction, and Cornell felt each loss deeply. Surrounded by memories and mourning, he began to spiral, and in trying to numb that pain, he turned back to an old and dangerous coping mechanism that had haunted him before. As Chris Cornell slipped deeper into depression, he fell back into the substance use that had marked his early years. At the same time, his life was changing in profound ways. On June 28, 2000, he became a father when his daughter Lillian Jean was born. The new millennium brought both hope and pressure, and not all of it landed gently. By 2002, Cornell was fronting a new supergroup, Audio Slave, but behind the scenes, he was still battling addiction. The struggle became impossible to hide when he was forced to cancel a scheduled appearance at Ozfest. Soon after, he admitted the truth. He had entered rehab. Cornell did come out sober, but recovery didn't instantly erase the weight he carried. In May 2005, Audioslave took part in a remarkable and unlikely event, a concert in Havana, Cuba. The show took months of negotiation and required cooperation between Cuba's Ministry of Culture and the U.S. Department of the Treasury, two sides rarely aligned. Against the odds, the concert went forward. The setting added a layer of irony. Cornell and Audioslave performed at the Anti-Imperialist Bandstand, a venue originally built by the Cuban government for protests against the United States. Despite the symbolism, music fans from across the country flooded into Havana for the chance to see an international rock band live. Cuban officials estimated that around 70,000 people attended. Over 2.5 hours, the band played 26 songs. The crowd sang, jumped, and even formed a mosh pit, many experiencing a moment they never thought possible. Because Audioslave was an American band, playing in Cuba meant navigating layers of bureaucracy and government approval. That experience left Chris Cornell wondering why more international artists hadn't taken advantage of the opportunity. Bands from places like the UK wouldn't have faced the same restrictions. Years later, he was genuinely pleased to see the Rolling Stones perform there, feeling that they had finally opened a door he'd helped push. Not long after, Cornell took on another British institution. In 2006, the producers of the James Bond franchise approached him to write the theme song for Casino Royale. The offer was an honor, but Cornell had doubts. He couldn't picture himself writing a song that literally used the film's title. The producers agreed to give him creative freedom, and the result was You Know My Name, a bold departure from tradition. The song reached #7 on the UK singles chart and made history in two ways. Cornell became the first American male artist to perform a Bond theme, but it was also the first Bond title song not included on the official soundtrack. Cornell's next move took him even further from familiar ground. In 2009, he partnered with producer and rapper Timbaland for his third solo album, Scream. The project stripped away much of his signature guitar-driven sound and leaned heavily into electronic beats and modern production. It was a major risk. While Cornell later described the album as a personal highlight, critics were far less forgiving. Spin dismissed it as having empty efficiency, and AllMusic labeled it one of those rare big-budget disasters. Soon after, Cornell received a response that felt far more personal than any review. A bad review from a magazine is easy enough to shrug off. Hearing it from another musician is different. When Scream came out, Trent Reznor of 9 Inch Nails publicly criticized the album and said Cornell had embarrassed himself. The comment stung, and it didn't age well. Not long after posting it, Reznor realized he was about to tour with Cornell and Soundgarden. The sharp words suddenly felt ill-timed. He backed off and sent Cornell an apology by email, quietly walking back what he'd said. Cornell didn't need validation from critics anyway. His fans were still fiercely loyal. On April 2, 2009, an Atlanta rock station even temporarily renamed itself Chris FM, devoting a full 24 hours to his music. The tribute went beyond non-stop songs. Cornell himself appeared as a guest DJ, spinning tracks from his own catalog and sharing personal favorites. It was a reminder that, regardless of trends or reviews, his voice still mattered. That support reached all the way to the White House. On January 21, 2013, Cornell performed at 2 major inaugural events for President Barack Obama. He played an acoustic set at the Commander-in-Chief's ball, then headed to the official inaugural ball later that night. Few rock singers ever get that kind of recognition, and it marked a high point in his public life. But the final chapter came quietly and suddenly. On May 17, 2017, Cornell took the stage with Soundgarden in Detroit. After the show, he returned to his room on the 11th floor of the MGM Grand Hotel. There, he spoke by phone with his wife, Vicky. Almost immediately, she sensed something was wrong. His speech was slurred, his tone distant. When she asked what was going on, he said he might have taken an extra anti-anxiety pill or two, then brushed it off by repeating the same phrase over and over. "I'm just tired." The conversation felt unsettling and unlike him. Vicky was hundreds of miles away and couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. Trusting her instincts, she reached out to Cornell's bodyguard, Martin Kirsten, and asked him to go to the room and check on Chris, hoping it was nothing, but fearing it wasn't. At 12:15 a.m., Martin Kirsten went to Chris Cornell's hotel room. The door was locked, and there was no response from inside. He returned to his own room and contacted the front desk, asking for help. Hotel security refused to intervene. With no other option, Kirsten called Vicky again and asked what he should do next. Her answer made it clear how frightened she was. Vicky told him to break the door down. After 6 or 7 hard blows, the door finally gave way. Inside, the bathroom door was open. Then Kirsten saw Cornell's feet. With Vicky still on the phone, he rushed to him. Cornell was unconscious, and there was a band tightly wrapped around his neck. Kirsten immediately removed it and began performing chest compressions, trying desperately to revive him. Paramedics arrived shortly before 1 a.m., but it was already too late. Chris Cornell was pronounced dead at 1:30 a.m. Authorities later ruled his death a suicide. The news devastated fans around the world, followed almost instantly by disbelief. For many, it was impossible to accept that someone who had just performed with such intensity could be gone hours later. As shock turned into grief, questions began to surface. Some focused on Kirsten's timeline, wondering why it took 41 minutes for emergency responders to reach the scene. The Detroit News raised concerns about the delay, fueling speculation that not everything about that night had been fully explained. The public wanted clarity, and answers that, for many, still felt incomplete. Authorities carefully reviewed the timeline Martin Kirsten provided, comparing it against phone records and hotel surveillance footage. After piecing everything together, investigators concluded that his account of that night was consistent and accurate. There was no evidence to suggest he had misled anyone about what happened before Chris Cornell's death. Attention then shifted to the autopsy, and this is where frustration began to grow, especially for Vicki Cornell. She publicly questioned whether the examination had been thorough enough, arguing that important details were overlooked. One concern she raised was a recent head injury Chris had suffered, which she felt should have been addressed in the report. That dissatisfaction helped fuel speculation and conspiracy theories about the true circumstances of his death. Vicki and her children then focused their attention on Cornell's physician, Dr. Robert Coblin. They accused him of prescribing what they described as dangerous, mind-altering medication without proper care. Their claim was that the drugs Cornell had been taking clouded his judgment and may have played a critical role in the decisions he made that night. The family took their case to Los Angeles Superior Court, pointing out that Coblin had prescribed lorazepam without seeing Cornell in person. In his defense, Coblin stated that Cornell had requested the medication for anxiety and that he was fully aware of the risks involved. With both sides presenting conflicting views, the final question was left to the judge: whether the doctor's actions had contributed to the loss of Chris Cornell's life. In the end, the case never went before a judge. Dr. Coblin and Chris Cornell's family reached a private settlement out of court, and the details were kept confidential. With the legal chapter closed, Cornell's family chose cremation. His funeral was held on May 26, 2017, giving loved ones, fans, and fellow musicians a chance to say goodbye. The service was emotional and deeply personal. It opened with a recording of Audioslave's "Like a Stone," followed by Cornell's final recorded song, "The Promise." One of the most powerful moments came when Chester Bennington, joined by Brad Delson of Linkin Park, performed Leonard Cohen's "Hallelujah." As the ceremony came to an end, Temple of the Dog's "All Night Thing" played softly, closing the farewell. Tributes poured in far beyond the funeral. On the night of Cornell's death, Seattle dimmed the lights of the Space Needle for an hour in his honor. That same evening, Ann Wilson of Heart performed "Black Hole Sun" on Jimmy Kimmel Live, a quiet, aching tribute to a fallen voice. Many fans felt the loss was devastating and unsettlingly familiar. Years earlier, in April 1994, Kurt Cobain's death had shaken the same city and scene. Cornell later said in a Rolling Stone interview that you couldn't predict a songwriter's fate simply by listening to their lyrics. Researchers would later challenge that idea. Studies examining Cornell's body of work found that over time his lyrics increasingly focused on depression, broken relationships, and darker, more fatalistic themes. Scientists suggested that these patterns pointed to someone who may have benefited from deeper clinical support. By the time those conclusions were drawn, however, it was already too late. News of Chris Cornell's death spread quickly, and the shock was immediate. Fans around the world flooded social media with tributes. His wife, Vicki, released a heartbreaking statement saying, "Chris's death is a loss that escapes words and has created an emptiness in my heart that will never be filled." His brother Peter also shared a deeply emotional post, calling Chris an icon and a legend. He wrote about how artists like Cornell lift people up in dark times, describing his brother as a warrior and a wizard, and shared 2 photos, one from their childhood and one taken not long before Chris died. The music world mourned alongside the fans. Elton John called Cornell the loveliest man. Jimmy Page praised his immense talent, and Tony Iommi said Cornell was one of his favorite singers and a genuinely kind person. A private memorial service was held at Hollywood Forever Cemetery for family and close friends. Afterward, the gravesite was opened to the public, and hundreds of fans lined up to pay their respects. Chris Cornell left behind more than unforgettable music. He left a story that forces us to look honestly at fame, mental health, and the quiet battles even the strongest voices can't always escape. His life was filled with brilliance, creativity, and love, but also with pain that too often went unseen until it was too late. So we want to ask you, what do you think truly weighed heaviest on Chris in his final years? The pressure of legacy, the struggle with mental health, or something deeper that never fully healed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you appreciate deep, thoughtful stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more untold stories like this.